Right, looks like we're live again. So let's just get the audio on. There we go. And let's go up here. So just before I switch screens again, so we've looked at the feedback on the lab, we've discussed the video, we've introduced PHP. What we're going to look at now is the bit that ties in with the second part of the video 4, which is about writing good code, standards, PHP doc, and so on. So there's a fair bit to do on that, but probably we'll be finished early, so that might be nice. Let's get that on, and hopefully that now works. Yes, so again you'll see I've pinched Magnus's slides from a few years back, but they're fine, so I'm still running with those. Thank you, Magnus. So what are we talking about with coding standards? Well, coding standards can be about lots of different things. So indentation is a coding standard, comments, variables, how we display variables and functions. White space is a part of it. File organisation can be a part of it. Naming conventions, programming practices, programming rules of thumb, and architectural best practices. They're all to do with coding standards. So there are no universal coding standards, but there will be practices that that will apply. Either individually, people develop their own standards, or if you in a place of work, you might find that there are standards that are imposed and that you need to go along with. So specific languages may have some guidelines, but syntax is not a coding standard, it is a language rule. So if it's a syntax thing, that's not a coding standard. It's not a coding standard that you put a semicolon at the end of each line in PHP, for example. That is a language rule. Okay, so keeping that separate is important. It won't work if you fail to follow the language, the syntax. But if you do something stupid with coding standards, coding standards, it'll still work. It'll just be messy and potentially lead to bugs. So that's that sort of thing can go on. So, as it says here, which standard should you follow? It doesn't matter, but you must be consistent, you must be logical, and you may have rules that apply in different institutions when you go places to work. Also, of course, if you're picking up someone else's code and modifying it, you probably find that however much it might irritate you, you're going to need to follow the convention that that person used, assuming they stuck consistently to a convention. The alternative is to rip out all the coding standard stuff and redo it yourself completely. Probably don't want to do that. So what about naming conventions? There are various different naming conventions, and often folk use slightly different types of naming conventions to signify different things. So we'll see in a slide or two's time that we might use different conventions to indicate that one is a variable name and the other is a global variable, for example. What about flat names? Flat names are simply the words joined together, no uppercase letters. So var20 would be an example, var film name, and you'd get that a lot with URLs. So I love the fact that near me is the bakery, justrolls.com or whatever it is, but I love the way that you can read it as just trolls, which is just my stupid sense of humour. But you know the URL thing where when it's all run together you can think, oh, I can break that up differently and get something fun out of it. So these can be used for a variety of reasons, usually down to personal preference. You'll see a theme running here. Camel case is what I personally use. It capitalises the first letter of each word, and it's usual to keep the first word in lowercase, though not in exclusively. So this would be var21 like that, and var film name like that. It is extremely popular, it is easy to read, and you've avoided any issue about spaces or joining characters or whatever they. Underscore is another one that's sometimes used, so this would be var_20_1 or film_name. That is also popular. It is also easy to read. Personally, I tend to avoid it because of issues in years gone by, where if you have some sort of documentation and it's for some reason underlined, or it's on a web page and it's a link or whatever, the underline deletes the underscore and you can't see it, and it looks like $film space name. So that's why personally I tend to avoid underscore, but not exclusively, and in PHP there are occasions when you have to use underscore, it's required. It is popular and it's easy to read. Underscore first, this is an example. There are some variables in PHP which begin $underscore. So $underscore global var or $underscore global underscore var. And it is usually used for global or class scope or inherited variables and functions, something that's got a wider scope than just the immediate area. And then, so that leading underscore is the crucial bit in that. Uppercase, sometimes you might find a word completely in uppercase, so as in constant here, and it's commonly used for constant names and little else. True and false are examples of that, although some languages, some interpreters, some compilers are very happy to go interchangeably between uppercase true and lowercase true. The Arduino SDK, is Software Developers Kit, is an example where it doesn't mind whether it's uppercase or lowercase, true is still true. Hyphens are generally not supported as name separators, so in PHP you cannot have $var hyphen name. Why? Because the hyphen is a logical operator. This would mean $var minus name, where name is a constant possibly. So again, as it says here, we're back to the syntactical highlighter. So your text editor that is context sensitive should make this sort of thing very obvious as you write your code. So as soon as you write that, if you're using a decent text editor, it should be obvious that this is not working. It's understanding it as $var minus name. Okay. So personal preference, it is up to you to decide generally what convention you wish to use. You may decide to use it based on ease of readability or completely irrational reasons. Thank you, Magnus. For example, this is me now, I almost always use only camel case. That's my personal preference. Why? Because various things and past history and stuff. Okay. So what about indentations? So you had someone last year or last year was it, on your web module? Someone mentioned that you have already had a big push on the idea of indentation being important. Is that right? So I don't need to spend too long on this. But so this is basically just saying this is actually quite hard to read, and this bit to me feels very like /div/div/div. And actually, personally, sometimes you may in your code have to have /div/div/div in your HTML. But if you put them one under the other, I will have the screaming heebie-jeebies, and I will definitely be verging on the point of apoplexy. Because what am I supposed to do with that? How am I supposed to understand that? If you indent it, this is big indents, and I have a problem with big indents because it then starts going way off the edge of the page or the screen or whatever. But at least the indents mean that I can now start to get an idea of the nesting going on here. And so one would say it's actually rather easier to understand the code once it's indented. You can see what's going on inside, then the next level, then the next level, and so on. You can actually start to say, oh yeah, I can see now it's going through this array and pulling out the topic in each book and then giving a list of the topics that are covered by that set of books. Indentation types, this is quite interesting. So tabs apparently are most common and easy to move code. An alternative is spaces. 2 spaces apparently is a common version of using spaces, or any other number of spaces. 8 might sometimes be used, as in this one. I think that's quite possibly 8, although it looks doesn't look like it's, that looks like it's 4, that looks like it's 5, 5, that looks like it's 3, okay, whatever. That might be a mistake. It might be meant to be 444. I don't know. There are some issues in that. So working with a fellow coder on a website in, so he's based in Salisbury. We've had all sorts of problems where I've used tabs, which are nice and easy, just press the tab key and away you go. Yeah, but if your text editor understands tabs differently, and then if you start mixing up tabs and spaces inadvertently, because you can't see the difference usually in a text editor between tabs and spaces, you start getting all sorts of problems and all your indentation goes all over the place. So it really is quite important to stick with one or the other, and personally I find tabs unreliable. You don't know whether that was a 4-space tab or a 2-space tab or a something else tab. Spaces are just sorted.
I thought you can tell the difference, because all the time when I have used that, it's when I do a tab it puts like a line next to it, but when I do spaces it just...
Depends on your editor. So yes, a good editor will show you what's in there in terms of tabs and so on, in which case fine, you know, you can start to see what's going on. But many otherwise good text editors won't show you that, so then it becomes a problem. But as it says up there, you know, up to you. You know, if you've got a good reason for going one way or the other, that's great. White space. So white space is very much, to me, it sort of rings bells of desktop publishing. What's desktop publishing? Years ago, when we had typewriters and things and computers first came in, we had word processing, which was sort of electronic typewriters with line feeds and carriage returns and things, which we thought about with HTML4 and BR tags and so on. But actually, we then had desktop publishing where you could actually genuinely publish and put graphics somewhere on the page and flow your text around the graphic and all sorts of lovely things. And white space is a crucial concept in publishing. You need the eyes to be able to have a sort of resting space, if you like. If the page is too busy, you just look at me, thank you. So it needs to be easy on the eye, like a stroll through a park where you can see where things are and appreciate that bit and appreciate that bit. And the white space actually manages that for you. It's just as true in programming. If your code is just all jammed together, then it's much harder to sort of navigate your way around the code. If you use white space appropriately and space things out, white space, it says somewhere, costs nothing. Maybe that's the next slide. But it does help you to read the code much more easily. So it isn't just about indentation, it's about pulling blocks of code apart and making sure it doesn't go too far off that end so it's hard to read and that sort of thing. So what it says white space is just blank bits. So indentation, yeah, but also empty lines. Important to break up your code, yeah, okay. White space costs nothing. There you are on the next slide. This is a repeat of the previous slide. I don't know why it came out like that. What about brackets? So it says brackets is another stylistic choice, so it may depend on person preference or being forced when you work. So for example, we've looked at these really. Function magic, curly braces, return magic var from nowhere, or this is exactly the same in functionality but just laid out differently. Function magic, open curly brace here, indent, return, same, and then close your curly braces there. Or this does the same thing, function magic, whatever, curly braces, return there, or function magic, no curly braces, return, as long as it's a single line there. They're all versions of the same thing, and the idea there of the if statement, but that's the same as that one. Okay, I haven't given an alternative there by the looks of it. What about style? So it doesn't matter what style you use as long as anyone who reads your code can understand it. You may be required to write using a certain style when working, be consistent and logical. So I'll just use that slide as a reminder to say, we have said it before, but just remind you that when you start you think, oh, okay, so I've got to write my code in such a way that some Herbert, whatever, if I'm allowed to say that nowadays, I think I am, You know, some person who I have no regard for, at some distant point needs to be able to understand my code. Well, if you can't understand my code, why are you even bothering? Sort of thing. No. Stop and think. In 6 months' time, you will come to your code and you will have forgotten everything that was in your head about that code. You'll be surprised how quickly you forget it. You will be like some other person who has no idea what you're about. You have to write your code in a way that means that someone who has no idea what was in your head when you wrote it, including you in 6 months' time, can pick up and see why you were doing things and where you were going and how you're doing it. So that's your goal. You're not writing for somebody else. Well, you are, but not just for somebody else. You're writing for yourself in 6 months' time when you've forgotten everything about what you were doing and why. That's a very knowing nod, which I like to see from you. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to documentation, because this is now an important part of that idea of writing for yourself in 6 months' time. So this is just as important as well-written and efficient code. It is the bit that computer people, coders, hate the most, because there's the what I would like to call the crossword challenge. You have a problem, you think, oh, how am I going to do this? And it can be quite, if you like that sort of thing, it can be quite a fun challenge. You get into the problem and think, oh, if that bit of code does this and that does that, and how can I make that? And finally you solve the problem, you get it pretty much right. Okay, solved it. I've lost interest now. Okay, pass it over, that works, yeah, you can get on with it. No, you haven't finished. You have got to write the documentation. Oh no, that's boring. I've done all the hard work. I've done the difficult bit. Yet you have to write down what you've done and how you got there. It's so important, because otherwise it's dead code. No one will be able to do anything with it when they need to change it later. So documentation allows others to understand what your code does. Documentation allows you to understand what your code does in 6 months' time when you've forgotten. Your notes may have decision rationale or other information which cannot be extrapolated from your code. Sorry about this, the typo. Example, what's going on here? Function process items, blah, whatever. Yeah, something about processing items or whatever is going on. Okay, we might find this a little bit easier to cope with. So $W is the weight of the items. Okay, so we're going to process some items and that's their weight. $IPB is the number of items you can get in a box. Okay, so we're talking about a standard size shipping box. How many of these items can fit into a standard size shipping box? And $U is the unit of weight. Okay, so now we're starting to get heads around it. So if the weight is 0, then return the error message. If $W is 0, we've got no weight to deal with. No items were, forget the H, no items were processed. Another typo. Else, otherwise we'll work out how many boxes we need. So $BT is the boxes total required. So that's what BT is, and nothing to do with the internet service provider. $BT equals the weight times the items per box. Okay, so that's how many boxes we need, and we're going to return the following data. So we're going to say the weight and the units, so that weight of items is using that number of boxes. So we worked out how many boxes we need for that weight of items, and then we get back to main code and set it out. So it's obviously doing 14. Look at this one. 14 tons with half an item per box. That doesn't make sense. Okay, whatever. So what about comments? In PHP, comments have started using double sloping thingammy comment. And this comments out the line from that point. So you can either comment out a whole line by putting that at the start of the line, or you can have a line and then put that at the end of the line and then have the comment tagged on the end of the line. I try and avoid doing that last thing. Sometimes it's quite useful if you've got a list of variables at the start and you want to remember what each variable is. You can just tag it alongside. That's quite useful. but on a longer line, that just makes the line too long. So I personally I try and avoid that, but that's a personal thing. You can also block comment code or comments using / star block of code / Okay. Now, on other occasions, I've been told, no, in PHP you can comment using lots of different ways. So back in the days of XHTML, we were very into the idea of using the hashtag would give a comment. Yes, but remember where we're going. We're going to be talking about PHP Documenter. Okay, I want us to stick to a particular standard, and so from our point of view, these are the two types of comment that we're going to be thinking about, so that we can follow the PHP Documenter standard. You can use comments anywhere where you think extra information is needed. This is always a sort of difficult one because, for example, on coursework you'll get marks awarded for good documentation. That includes commenting. If you don't comment, you can throw away, I don't know, 10% just like that, just by not commenting, or by not commenting appropriately. What's appropriate commenting? That's the difficult bit, because if you go mad and comment every single bit of every single line, it just ends up that you can't see the wood for the trees. There's so many comments you can't actually see the code. That sometimes it's useful just to be able to see a little block of a few lines of code and say, I can work that out, especially if you're using variable meaningful names. No, meaningful variable names. So getting the level of commenting right is important, but there needs to be enough so that other people and you in 6 months' time can see what's going on, and not so much that actually you can't see the code, you can't work out what's going on. So what else is it saying here? We can use comments to describe a block of code or to act as titles informing the reader about what code is coming next. So formal PHP documentation. PHP doc is a formal standard for documenting PHP code. You can go, there is a site, yeah, here we go, the PHP doc site, php.org, will tell you about the PHP doc standard. It is one particular standard. You could come up with other ones. It is very easy to understand, but the key here for us is that it is machine readable. If you document your code in PHP doc, following the standard correctly, then two things immediately happen. One is that when you've finished your PHP project, you can use the PHP doc tools to give you a printout of all your code. It will effectively automatically produce the documentation for you. Any classes, when we get to object PHP, any classes you define will be defined through PHP doc. It will tell you what methods are there, what attributes are there. It will show you how things interrelate. It will do all the documentation for you, providing you have followed the PHP doc standard. And it will do it, it's able to do it because it's machine readable. Second thing that other folk on this course have found in previous years is it depends on which code editor you're using. But a good code editor, if you're following the PHP doc standard, will, as you start to type, it will auto-complete for you. It's a sort of, it provides a sort of facility for your own code that you've designed, where it says, oh, do you mean this function? And then it will prompt you as to what parameters it's expecting and what those parameters mean, providing you followed the standard. That is really neat. You start typing, hey, that's my function. It's telling me about my function that I've created and about what I need, how to auto-complete it. Brilliant. There's a few more things in there about PHP Documenter and so on. So how does it work? Well, there's a number of tags which describe attributes of the code, possibly a function, class or variable. Some common tags they will be, forget that this is just listing, so that's not part of it, but within the commenting, you might have an @param, which is going to define a parameter, so it's presumably a function or a method that you're defining, and @param will tell you about a particular parameter. what sort of data type is it, you know, what is its role. At return is, again, assuming we're talking about a function or a method, what value does this return when it completes. At to do might be something that you want to record to say, I've got this far with it, I'd really like to, it's okay, it's working maybe, but I'd really like to tidy it up so it does blah blah blah. So at to do in there. At author, I think, should be mandatory in any block of code. You need to know who's written it, and preferably some sort of contact details like an email address or something. Most interestingly, if you want to use and adapt someone's code, you will usually find that most authors, if they've given you their name and their email address, if you email them and say, oh, I've come across your code, I really like it and I'd like to do this with it, would you mind if I use your code? They'll say, wow, I'm thrilled that A, someone's noticed my code, and B, someone wants to use it. Yes, please do. I have yet to find anyone who said, no, hands off, it's copyright, you're not touching it. No one has ever said that to me over the years. Not once. Which is just an interesting thing when you get to copyright things. You have to be more careful with things like university projects, you know, like third-year project or whatever, because that's okay, but you must acknowledge it if you do that. So be careful about using someone else's code. It's actually, I mean, we do that all the time. We see someone else's code, we think, oh, that's triggered off some ideas, and we move on from there, and we use it, we understand it, and we develop it. That's fine, and you should be doing that. Just have to be a little bit careful about the plagiarism thing in university work for assessment. So if there's any possible issue about plagiarism, just acknowledge it. So I built this on from, then you have to be careful because you might find a tutor who said, oh, well, it's not your work. No, I took it, I understood it, and I developed it. It's now mine, with my ideas in there. But not all tutors understand that. You have to be a bit careful. Formal PHP doc, break down the components. So this is a typical sort of heading block for either a file or, in this case, actually a function, it says. So this is a function to find the total number of M-class planets in a galaxy. So it's iterating through each planet in a solar system to check for M-class planets. So this bit is crucially important. This is not PHP commenting, this is PHP doc commenting. Okay, we are following the PHP doc standard here. So it has /*, new line. Each line starts star, and I think space, basically. Starting each line, so there's no carriage return there, otherwise there'd need to be another star. All the way down. And the app params, here are the tags in there, so it's taking in a galaxy object variable called $galaxy in the code here, and it returns an integer. That's a typical PHP doc block, and that's how it will look. And you'll find in the videos, as we introduce coding and commenting into the video series, we are using this standard in the videos. Okay. Here's the whole function with that in. So here's our block, and then here's the function that runs through and finds the total number of M-class planets and returns that. That's a little example, interestingly, where camel case doesn't quite work as nicely as one would like, because we've got total MC hang on, oh, of course, total M-class planets. It's sort of a bit, because of you've got a single thing there, it runs into the next one. So we're saying please do read up on PHP doc, as it's a requirement for the future labs and the coursework. And that's it basically. So at 10:30 we're done. Russell will be seeing you at 4 o'clock, and he will take you through the linking PHP to the JSON feed for the lab. So that'd be quite important for lab. So again, if you guys, the three of you who are not here, if you're watching this later rather than now, do make sure that you have a look through this stuff and have a look at the video too. Don't forget before Thursday. And I will see you on Thursday. Have a good week and have a good day.